value of having the points of view that they express. The comments I guess I'd like to make are based, first of all, on having spent some time reading David Harvey's paper, albeit quickly, given that this is a particularly busy week for me. And I guess some reflections on how I see what's expressed in this paper as it relates to what is happening here in the city of Cincinnati and has happened here in Cincinnati over some period of time. And I understand that we are here to talk about Over-the-Rhine in relation to the ideas that David Harvey has expressed. The first comment that I wanted to make is that Cincinnati is not New York or San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or London. It's a very different circumstance. And I think that the whole concept of gentrification is clearly, at least in part, what we're here talking about today. And I think it's worth raising the point that the idea of gentrification, first as a term anyway, first surfaced, as I understand it, in the Washington, D.C. area. And the difference that I would like, I guess, to point out is that when you talk about places like New York or San Francisco or London, or even the D.C. area, you're talking about areas with a real estate market that is vastly different than what we have here. We don't have the kind of pressure in a real estate market that drives the kinds of things that led to that term being expressed in the District of Columbia. We don't have the kinds of pressure that lead to what we see taking place, certainly in San Francisco or Manhattan, and some of the other places mentioned in this paper. So we need to look at Cincinnati a little differently. I think also that some of what's being talked about in this paper has to do with the whole concept of what it means to own property, or land in particular. And I've thought for a long time that there could be an entire class taught at the planning school on that subject alone, because our concept of owning land, what it means in this country, is different than it is in other places. And it has even really evolved over time. There are all kinds of ways somebody might own land. They own the surface, but maybe not the mineral rights below it, and so forth. I don't want to get lost in that, but I think part of what we're talking about here is a concept of land ownership in this country that's different than it is in other places. Thirdly, I'd like to make a point about cities in the United States as opposed to other parts of the world as well. Some of you may have known Robert Manley, who was on the faculty of the planning school until he passed some years ago. And he made a point when I took a class from him that I thought was rather interesting, that cities in the United States are somewhat unique in the sense that in most parts of the world, property values follow a somewhat traditional model where the highest property value is at the center of the city and tends to fall away as you move further from that center. That very dramatically is not true in the United States. And it varies, of course, from one place to another. But what has happened here in this country, I think, is a product of policies of the federal government in the post-war era, and that's talked about in this paper, where we made major investments that tended to drive development and population away from the urban center. We neglected the urban centers to a certain extent. And then I think there was an element of, and still is, an element of racial tension in this country that has contributed to that as well. So that all forms part of the background of this discussion. I think it's interesting to think about some of these ideas in light of what's going on right now in Occupy Wall Street and Occupy a whole bunch of different places in this country and in the world, because I think people are beginning to ask some questions about how our whole society is structured, and those questions go well beyond the structure of the city, but they have some relationship to the ideas that are expressed here. I'd like to spend just a minute about talking about Over-the-Rhine in particular, what's gone on, in my perception anyway, over the years. Over-the-Rhine has been a controversial subject for actually quite a long time. And it remains so to today. In fact, it's intricately tied to one of the more controversial issues on our ballot next Tuesday, and that would be the streetcar line. But over a long period of time, the population of Over-the-Rhine has changed pretty dramatically. There was a time, it's called Over-the-Rhine because there was a time, of course, when the population was made up of primarily German and Irish immigrants back when it was originally constructed. In the 60s, when I was growing up, probably a large portion of the population of Over-the-Rhine was more of Appalachian descent, people who had come here to Cincinnati from maybe the first and second generation from Kentucky, Tennessee. They came here during the war to work and tended to, many of them were lower income and tended to accumulate in Over-the-Rhine. And then more recently, Over-the-Rhine has become largely an African-American community, and it has remained a low-income community. And finally, and I don't want to talk too long here, but I think we have to think about Over-the-Rhine also is a historical artifact. It is a truly unique urban space in terms of architecture and urban design. It's a remarkable asset that the city of Cincinnati would be foolish not to find some way to preserve and retain. And I say that in this sense that most of the buildings there that we're looking at today have been there for well over a century. Most of them are in need of significant upgrades. There are many buildings in Over-the-Rhine that are vacant, and some of them are in jeopardy of either falling down or being torn down. And so when you put that in the context of what's gone on in the last, in my view, in the last 20 years, there was a long period of time where Over-the-Rhine became a political football, in a sense, between two different competing points of view. One of those points of view advocated the redevelopment of Over-the-Rhine for basically a different population than who had been living there. And then the other point of view advocated, to a certain extent, protecting Over-the-Rhine for the population that did live there, and incorporated into that the idea that renovation should take place for the purpose of keeping that community of people in place. And those two political points of view, as they contested with each other, essentially created a point of stalemate, where nothing happened. And as a consequence of that, Over-the-Rhine continued to deteriorate. We continued to lose buildings. And secondly, eventually we began to lose population. The number of people who live in Over-the-Rhine today is dramatically lower than it was 30 years ago. So it was only maybe within the last, certainly within the last 10 years, but maybe the last 5, that stalemate began to break, obviously largely with the intervention of 3CDC, and we began to see the significant redevelopment take place in Over-the-Rhine that is taking place today. I personally think that in many respects that's a good thing. I think we have to do that carefully and sensitively, but I think the fact that that is taking place means that there is a real chance that Over-the-Rhine will exist 100 years from now. And I think there was a time when it was entirely possible that Over-the-Rhine would look much more like what we see on the west side of I-75, in the Queensgate area. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that there was a day when that area of the city was almost identical to Over-the-Rhine. And in the 60s, we tore all of it down and replaced it with something that I suspect not many of us would regard as particularly aesthetically pleasing, and in many respects at this point that property also is now declining in value and will eventually present itself as a